Good afternoon, everyone. Dear students, today we will continue reading Chapter 6, The God of the Only World, written by Amitav Ghosh. This is Part 2. Last time we mentioned that this chapter is written by the narrator, Amitav Ghosh, in memory of his friend, Aga Shahid Ali. They became friends at the time they stayed in the same neighborhood in the United States. Aga Shahid Ali has been diagnosed with cancer and he urges the narrator to write about him when he dies. And without finding any excuse, the narrator agrees. He keeps his promise and he pays a tribute to his friend by writing this piece about him after he is gone. So these are two main characters, Amitav Ghosh, the narrator and a well-known writer, and Aga Shahid Ali, a poet, his friend who has been diagnosed with cancer. The narrator had called his friend Aga Shahid Ali on 25th of April 2001 to remind him that they had been invited by a friend at his house for lunch. At that time, Shahid was undergoing treatment for cancer but was able to speak and move around. He had occasional lapses of memory. As the narrator was talking to Shahid, Shahid had a blackout and feared that he might die. Shahid was fine after some time and told the narrator that he was suffering from cancer and was told that he would die in a few months. The narrator tried to reassure Shahid that he would be fine. However, Shahid urged him to write about him after he is gone. The narrator wanted to avoid writing about his friend's death, but finally he agreed to do so. The narrator and Shahid lived a few blocks away in Brooklyn. The narrator had read Shahid's poetry collection, The Country Without a Post Office. In 1997, long before he had met him, Shahid belonged to Kashmir and had studied in Delhi. The narrator also studied in Delhi and they both got in touch through common friends in 1998. They were no more than acquaintances till they moved to Brooklyn in 2000, a year before Aga Shahid Ali died. In Brooklyn, they met for meals and discovered that there was a lot in common between them. They both loved Rogan Josh, Roshnara Begum and Kishore Kumar and had an attachment for old Bollywood films. They were also both indifferent to cricket. In this chapter, the narrator Amitav Ghosh describes Shahid. He is described as a sociable and witty person. He had many friends and liked to have people around him. He had the ability to convey the normal things in the most magical way. Even after being diagnosed with cancer, he continued holding these parties at his home. Many people would come, his students, his friends, his relatives, and so on. He would plan the parties in such a way and take a special interest that the food cooked in the party was up to the mark. He was very joyous. He would say, "I love it that people come and there is always food. I love this spirit of festivity. It means that I don't have time to be depressed. His apartment was a spacious and airy split level on the seventh floor of a newly renovated building. There was a cavernous study on the top floor and a wide terrace that provided a magnificent view of the Manhattan skyline across the East River. Shahid loved this view of the Brooklyn waterfront slipping like a ghat into the East River under the glittering lights of Manhattan. Here the narrator describes the place where his friend lived. He says his apartment was a spacious. Spacious means having a lot of place, a lot of space. Spacious and airy. Spacious and airy means well lit and ventilated, having ample space. Split level means having floors on slightly different levels with a few stairs connecting them. This is how his apartment looked like. It was on the seventh floor of a newly renovated building. Renovated means restored. To renovate means to restore something old, especially a building, to a good state of repair. This was a newly renovated building. There was a cavernous. Cavernous refers to something that is huge, something that has a very large space inside, like a cavern in size. This was his study room on the top floor, and there was a wide terrace that provided a splendid view of the Manhattan skyline. Skyline means an outline of land and buildings defined against the sky. Shahid loved this view of the Brooklyn waterfront slipping. Waterfront refers to a part of a town or city that is next to an area of water, such as a river or the sea. Waterfront. This waterfront was slipping like a ghat. Slipping means it was moving downwards, like a ghat into the East River under the glittering lights of Manhattan. Glittering referring to shining, sparkling lights of Manhattan. The journey from the foyer of Shahid's building to his door was a voyage between continents. On the way up, the rich fragrance of Rogan Josh and Huck would invade the dull, grey interior of the elevator against the background of the songs and voices that were always echoing out of his apartment. Even the ringing of the doorbell had an oddly musical sound. Suddenly, Shahid would appear, flinging open the door, releasing a great cloud of him into the frosty New York air. "Oh, how nice," he would cry, clapping his hands. The author further describes the place where his friend lived. The journey from the foyer. Foyer is a room in a house or apartment that leads from the front door to other rooms. The journey from this foyer of Shahid's building to his door was a voyage between continents. This is how the narrator describes his place. He says it was a voyage. Voyage refers to a long journey. Something like expedition, a journey involving traveling by sea or in space. So he says, the journey from this foyer, from this room, to his door was a voyage between continents. It was huge. On the way up, the rich fragrance. Fragrance means a pleasant, sweet smell. There was this sweet smell of Rogan Josh, a type of dish, and hak, which is also a type of green vegetable dish. This smell would invade. It would capture the dull grey interior of the elevator. So even in the elevator, one could smell what was being cooked in Shahid's kitchen. Doa refers to gloomy, grey interior, grey insides of the elevator. Even in the elevator, you could smell the fragrance of Rogan Josh and hak. In the background, there would be songs and voices that were always echoing out of his apartment. His apartment was always very lively. Echoing means sound or sounds caused by the reflection of sound waves from a surface back to the listener. Even, the narrator says, even the ringing of the doorbell had an oddly musical sound. Even this doorbell had a strange musical sound. And then suddenly, Shahid would appear, flinging open the door. Flinging means to throw or to move or to do something suddenly and with a lot of force. So Shahid would appear, he would open the door. Flinging open means he would open them quickly and energetically, releasing a great cloud of hing into the frosty New York air. After Shahid would open the door, he would release, there would be some smell that he would let go, a smell of hing, and this smell would come into the cold, frosty New York air. "Oh, how nice," he would cry, clapping his hands. "How nice that you've come to see your little Muslim." Invariably, there'd be some half dozen or more people gathered inside. Poets, students, writers, relatives, and in the kitchen someone would always be cooking or making tea. Almost to the very end, even as his life was being consumed by the disease, he was the center of a perpetual carnival, an endless meal of talk, laughter, food, and of course, poetry. Here the narrator explains further how would the atmosphere look like at his friend's place. He says, invariably means always. There would always be some half dozen or more people. It means there would always be a lot of people at his place. They would be gathered inside, different kinds of people, poets, students, writers, relatives, and so on. And in the kitchen, someone would always be cooking or making tea. There was always something happening. And almost to the very end, even as his life was being consumed by disease, consumed by his disease, consumed means eaten up. Consumed by the disease means the disease was already ruining him. He was still the center of a perpetual carnival. Perpetual means continuing forever in the same way. Carnival refers to a festival, a celebration. And it always looked like this, as if it's never gonna end. The author says it It was an endless meal of talk, laughter, food, and of course, poetry. No matter how many people there were, Shahid was never so distracted as to lose track of the progress of the evening's meal. From time to time, he would interrupt himself to shout directions to whoever was in the kitchen. Yes, now, add the dahi now. Even when his eyesight was failing, he could tell from the smell alone exactly which stage the Rogan Josh has reached. And when things went exactly as they should, he would sniff the air and cry out loud, "Ah, khana ka kya mehk hai?" Through these lines, we find a lot of things about Aga Shahid Ali. Even after he found out that he was very sick, he kept his spirits high. The author says no matter how many people there were, Shahid was never so distracted, he was never so lacking in attention as to lose track of the progress of the evening's meal. To lose track of something means to no longer know what's happening or not to remember something. That means that he was always aware what is the progress of the meal. From time to time, he would interrupt himself to shout directions to whoever was in the kitchen. Every now and then, he would interrupt himself. He would stop, go in the kitchen, and he would shout his own directions. Even when his eyesight was failing, it means when his vision was getting affected, even then he could tell from the smell alone exactly which stage the Rogan Josh had reached. And when things went exactly as they should, he would sniff the air, he would smell the air, and he would cry out loud. He would shout out loud. Ah, khana ka kya mehk hai? Here we see that he was enjoying not only making food, but he was really enjoying the whole festive atmosphere. Shahid was legendary for his prowess in the kitchen, frequently spending days over the planning and preparation of a dinner party. It was through one such party, given while he was in Arizona, that he met James Merrill, the poet who was to radically alter the direction of his poetry. It was after this encounter that he began to experiment with strict metrical patterns and verse forms. The narrator says that his friend was legendary. Legendary means very famous and admired or spoken about. He was legendary for his prowess, for his skill, great or extraordinary ability or skill. Prowess means skill, extraordinary skill. He was famous for his skills in the kitchen, frequently spending days over the planning and preparation of a dinner party. He would spend days planning the parties. And it was through one such party, the party that was given while he was in Arizona, that he met James Merrill. James Merrill was the poet who was to radically alter the direction of his poetry. To radically alter means to change drastically. The direction of his poetry, after meeting James Merrill, had changed drastically. And it was after this encounter, it was after this meeting, this experience, that he began to experiment with strict metrical patterns and verse forms. Metrical Patterns is a metrical structure, the pattern of the beats in a piece of music that includes meter and other rhythmic aspects. So the way he was writing changed drastically. No one had a greater influence on Shahid's poetry than James Merrill. Indeed, in the poem in which he most explicitly prefigured his own death, I dream I am at the ghat of the only world, he awarded the envoy to Merrill. Shahid, hush, this is me, James. The loved one always lives. So, after meeting James Merrill, Shahid had drastically changed the way he was writing. And as the narrator says, in one of the poems, he most explicitly means clearly or directly, in a clear, detailed manner. He exactly prefigured. To prefigure means to predict, to imagine something beforehand. It means to show or suggest that something will happen in the future. So in this poem, he had clearly indicated, predicted his own death. And he says he awarded the envoy. He awarded means he gave, he dedicated the envoy. Envoy in poetry is used to describe. It's a short stanza at the end of a poem, such as ballad, used to address someone or to comment. So in one of these envoys, Shahid has written the dedication. Shahid, hush, this is me, James. The loved one always lives. Shahid placed great store on authenticity and exactitude in cooking and would tolerate no deviation from traditional methods and recipes. For those who took shortcuts, he had only pity. From here, we can as well see how much he enjoyed the whole process of making food. He placed great store. To place great store means to think that something is very important. He thought it's very important for cooking to have authenticity. Authenticity means the quality of being genuine or real. And exactitude. Exactitude means the quality or an instant of being exact. This is how cooking should be according to Shahid. He placed great value, great importance on authenticity and exactitude in cooking, and he would tolerate no deviation. He would accept nothing different. Deviation means doing something that is different from what people consider to be acceptable or normal. There was no deviation from traditional methods and recipes. These traditional recipes were to be followed exactly. And for those who took shortcuts, he had only pity. He didn't like the people who would take shortcuts, who would change the recipe or the traditional method. He had a special passion for the food of his region, one variant of it in particular, Kashmiri food in the Pandit style. I asked him once why this was so important to him, and he explained that it was because of a recurrent dream in which all the Pandits had vanished from the valley of Kashmir and their food had become extinct. This was a nightmare that haunted him, and he returned to it again and again in his conversation and his poetry. Here we also find out that Aga Shahid Ali had a special passion for the food of his region. and one variant in particular. He used to call it Kashmiri food in the Pandit style. So the narrator asked him why this was so important to him, and he said that it was because of this recurrent dream. Recurrent dream means a dream that is happening again many times, a repeating dream. So in this repeating dream, he dreams that all the Pandits had vanished from the valley of Kashmir and their food too had become extinct. Extinct means something that no longer exists. This was the dream that was recurring, repeating over and over again. This was a nightmare that haunted him. To haunt means to cause repeated suffering or anxiety. Something you have in your mind and you can't get rid of it. This was his nightmare. And he returned to it again and again. He would talk about it again and again in the conversation with other people as well as in his poetry. And this is one of his poems. We know very well that the author was also, at the time of political violence in Kashmir, which started from 1980s, he was also a regular visitor. He would come to Kashmir very often to visit his family. So he was also a witness to this violence. And this is one of his poems. At a certain point, I lost track of you. You needed me. You needed to perfect me. In your absence, you polished me into the enemy. Your history gets in the way of my memory. At a certain point, I lost track. To lose track of someone or something means to no longer know what is happening with someone. I lost you. At this one particular point, I lost you. I lost track of you. Further, he continues saying, you needed me. You needed to perfect me, to make me better. In your absence, meaning without your presence. I'm polished, which means I'm made into the enemy. Just the opposite. Your history gets in the way of my memory. We have already mentioned that Shahid used to write about dreams, death, and memory. A lot of other themes as well. He continues, I'm everything you lost, your perfect enemy. Your memory gets in the way of my memory. There is nothing to forgive. You won't forgive me. I hid my pain even from myself. I revealed my pain only to myself. There is nothing to forgive. You won't forgive me. If only somehow you could have been mine. What would not have been possible in the world? In this poem, Aga Shahid Ali talks about himself and Kashmir. He says that he disclosed his pain only to himself. And he says there is nothing to forgive. He must be also referring to his absence from Kashmir. He says, if only somehow you could have been mine. If only you could be something that I could hold. Everything would have been possible. So once, in conversation, he told me that he also loved Bengali food. I protested. But Shahid, you've never even been to Calcutta. So once, his friend, who was already diagnosed with cancer, was telling him that he is very fond of Bengali food. The narrator opposed. He says, I protested. I objected, saying that, Shahid, you have never even been to Calcutta. How would you know about Bengali food? But his friend said no. But we had friends who used to bring us that food. When you ate it, you could see that there were so many things that you didn't know about, everywhere in the country. What I say is, why can't you be happy with the cuisines and the clothes and the music and all these wonderful things? He paused and added softly, at least here we have been able to make a space where we can all come together because of the good things. Talking about Bengali food, once Aga Shahid Ali had told the narrator that there are some things which we are not in knowledge of. There are some things which are happening everywhere in the country, but we are not aware of it. And further, he explains, why can't you be happy with all these things and music and food? Then he paused and said, at least here we have some space. We were able to make a space where we can all come together because of the good things. Because good things were connecting them. At that time when Aga Shahid Ali was diagnosed with cancer, he was surrounded by the loved ones and good things, as he says. What he wonders is, why can't we be happy with all these things? Why should there be so many difficulties in life? Of the many good things in which he took pleasure, none was more dear to him than the music of Begum Akhtar. So, one of the good things he liked was the music of Begum Akhtar. He had met the great ghazal singer when he was in his teens through a friend, and she had become an abiding presence and influence in his life. After meeting Begum Akhtar in his teens, she had become an abiding presence. Abiding meaning something that is not likely to change. Her presence was always there, like a guidance and influence in his life. Shahid had a fund of stories. He had a collection of stories about her sharpness in repartee. Sharpness refers to some intensity or the quality or state of being sharp. So she was very articulate. Repartee refers to conversation that is full of some clever and funny comments. So he had many stories about her being very sharp in conversation. Shahid was himself no mean practitioner of repartee. This means that he was very similar as well. On one famous occasion at Barcelona Airport, he was stopped by a security guard just as he was about to board a plane. So just before he was about to enter the plane, he was stopped by a security guard. The guard, a woman, asked, "What do you do?" "I'm a poet," Shahid answered. "What were you doing in Spain?" And he answered, "Writing poetry." No matter what the question, Shahid worked poetry into his answer. He would always mention his poetry. Finally, the exasperated woman asked, "Are you carrying anything that could be dangerous to the other passengers?" Finally, exasperated means extremely annoyed. Exasperated. It means also impatience, because things are not happening the way you want them to be happening. So the lady, the security guard, was exasperated. She was a bit annoyed, and she asked him, is he carrying anything that could be dangerous to other passengers? And Shahid's answer was, he clapped a hand to his chest and cried, only my heart. This is the way he would give answers as well. And this is what it is being mentioned about Begum Akhtar, her sharpness in repartee. So they were both very similar when it comes to giving an answer. This was one of his great Wildian moments, and it was to occasion the poem Barcelona Airport. So this is how the poem Barcelona Airport came to being. It means that this was one of his great special moments. Wildian refers to Oscar Wilde, relating to or characteristic of Oscar Wilde or his works, especially in being witty. So this was one of his great Wildian moments, and it was to occasion. To occasion means to give rise to something, to bring out, to cause. So this moment brought out the poem Barcelona Airport. He wrote a poem, Barcelona Airport. He treasured these moments. I long for people to give me an opportunity to answer questions, he told me once. To treasure means to cherish or value. Shahid cherished these moments. He would say, I long for people. I long means to long for something, means to desire greatly, to yearn for something. So he would say, I yearn for people, I desire for people to give me an opportunity to answer questions. On 7th of May, I had the good fortune to be with him when one such opportunity presented itself. This is one time when he presented his witness, one of his Wildian moments. And the author says, I was present. It was on 7th of May. This is what he says. Shahid was teaching at Manhattan's Baruch College in the spring semester of 2000, and this was to be his last class. Indeed, the last he was ever to teach. This was one of the moments, one of the Wildian moments. The narrator says that he was going to see his class. So he went there to Manhattan's Baruch College in the spring semester of 2000, and this class was special because this will be his last class, the last he was ever to teach. The narrator was interested. He wanted to see him teaching. The class was to be a short one, for he had an appointment at the hospital immediately afterwards. This class was supposed to be lasting very shortly, because he had an appointment at the hospital immediately after the class. I had heard a great deal about the brilliance of Shahid's teaching, but this was the first and only time that I was to see him perform in a classroom. The narrator says that he had heard a lot about Shahid's teaching, about the brilliance of his teaching, but this was the first and only time, the only opportunity that he had to see him perform in the classroom. It was evident from the moment we walked in that the students adored him. They had printed a magazine and dedicated the issue to him. Shahid, for his part, was not in the least subdued by the sadness of the occasion. So here the narrator says that it was clear, it was evident from the moment they walked in that the students adored him. To adore means to love and respect someone deeply. It was so obvious that the students adored him. They had printed a magazine and they dedicated the issue, that publication, to him. And as far as Shahid concerned, he was not in the least subdued. Subdued means quiet, slightly sad and worried. He was not sad at all. The occasion was a sad one, but he was in high spirits. He was not sad. He knew this is the last time he is ever going to teach. From beginning to end, he was a sparkling diva. Akhtar incarnate, brimming with laughter and nakra. Here the narrator says that from the beginning till the end he was a sparkling diva. Sparkling diva means very interesting. He was very alive. He says Akhtar incarnate. Incarnate means in human form of Akhtar, whom he adored. Incarnate also means very similar to what has just been mentioned. He was just like Akhtar, and he was brimming with laughter. Brimming means to be full of something. He was brimming with laughter and nakra, some whimsical behavior. When an Indian student walked in late, he greeted her with a cry, "Oh, my little subcontinental has arrived." Clasping his hands, he feigned a swoon. It stirred such a tide of patriotism in me to behold another South Asian. So when one of the students came late, it was an Indian student, he greeted her with a cry. He cried out, "Oh, my little subcontinental has arrived." And he was clasping his hands. He was clapping his hands. He feigned a swoon. To feign a swoon means to enter in a state of some ecstasy or hysterical rapture. He was very, very much in ecstasy. To feign a swoon also means to lose consciousness. So he was clasping his hands and he said, "It stirs such a tide of patriotism." It stirs means it brings up. It brings up such a tide, such a wave of patriotism in me to behold another South Asian. I'm so proud, in other words. His time at Penn State he remembered with unmitigated pleasure. I grew as a reader, I grew as a poet, I grew as a lover. This is how he describes his time at Penn State. The narrator says that he would remember this time with unmitigated pleasure. Unmitigated means absolute, something like complete. It was absolute pleasure. He would always remember this time with absolute pleasure. And he would say, I grew as a reader, I grew as a poet, I grew as a lover. I continued to grow. He fell in with a vibrant group of graduate students, many of whom were Indian. This was, he often said, the happiest time of his life. At this time, he interacted with students a lot, and especially with Indian students. Vibrant means something which is very joyful. So this time he remembers as the happiest time of his life. Later, Shahid moved to Arizona to take a degree in creative writing. This in turn was followed by a series of jobs in colleges and universities. Hamilton College, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and finally the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, where he was appointed professor in 1999. He was on leave from Utah doing a brief stint at New York University when he had his first blackout in February 2000. Here we find out that after he moved to Arizona to take a degree in creative writing, he got some jobs at different colleges and universities. He was also appointed professor in 1999. And then, when he was on leave from Utah, doing a brief stint refers to time or period or stretch. He was doing this stretch at New York University when he had his first blackout. He lost consciousness in February 2000. We know that he passed away in 2001. Dear students, this is part 2 of our chapter 6. We will continue with reading next time. Have a good day and see you soon.